I guess we'll get started, and we gotta start with the start, which is Mundus, which is the universe, like their whole shtick. And Mundus was formed when these two, like, I guess, concepts, some people view them as sentient, most don't. They're just kind of conceptual things. Anu representing stasis and Padamai representing change. And they kind of both come from, like, the void. Although there's an argument that their interplay created the void, blah, blah, blah. But setting that aside for a moment, they came together, and the interplay of their whole shtick created the Arbus. There's no good way to pronounce that. Orbis. And that's where all the stuff comes. That's where all the stuff is. Everything in the universe is in there. Now, Anu, also known as Anu-El, but Anu-El is also a different thing. So Anu and Padamai both sort of birthed a soul of their own. Padamai birthed Sithis, father of the void, also known as the Dread Father. If you're familiar with the Dark Brotherhood, they worship Sithis. And Anu created Anu-El, which is, the other one. Anu-El eventually became, or kind of birthed his own soul to become Auriel, aka Akatosh, aka the main god. We're going to be talking about the gods. But the gods that are worshipped mostly by the people in the Elder Scrolls universe are considered Anuic versus Padamaic, or Padamaic, which is really interesting because typically change is associated with mortals, because we're constantly changing, evolving, and whatnot. But in the Elder Scrolls universe, we are primarily associated with Anu, with stasis. And so Sithis and the Void is generally considered evil, but it's technically not evil. Also worth noting that there are numerous creation myths involved with all this stuff. I'm going with the most generally accepted and most broad term one, but we're going to get into disparity. But, one of my favorite books in the series claims that Sithis was, as it says, Sithis was the start of the house, that everything came from Sithis, but we're gonna get into Sithis at a later date, not in this PowerPoint. You can't see me, I'm completely talking with my hands right now. My, hands are just all over the place doing my gay little limp wrist shit. Okay, so, in, Mundus, in the Orbis, there are kind of three planes. There's Mundus, which is, the universe. There's Aetherius, and there's Oblivion, which is probably the one you're most familiar with because Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion is named after it. It's also the most fun one. So, in the midst of Mundus is Nirn, which is the main planet. It's the planet everything in the series takes place on. And most of it takes place on one continent called Tamriel. And there are other continents like Akavir and Yokuda and Atmora and Pyandonia and whatnot, or Pyandonia and Thras, but most of that isn't going to come up. Anyway, basically Earth, main continent, game takes place on is Tamriel. It's where all the mortals live and where the Atata became mortal. We're going to talk about the Atata, but people on Nirn are mortal. And that's the main thing. Now, Aetherius There are other continents. Some of them are ex-continents. Like Yokuda kind of sank when the Red Guards left. Yokuda sank into the ocean.
Now thou art a blade of the dark moon, hunteth the enemies of the lords by the power of the dark sun.
Power up L Pro Phase 366 Pogdalin Power UPR.
Zeus, thank you very much for 8 months. That's, what, 2/3 of the way to a year? Thank you for your long-time support. Hi, Mango! But yes, thank you. And sorry about this little cough. I was hoping I'd be over it by now, but at least it's not the vid. Anyway, next is Aetherius. Excuse me. Aetherius is kind of like heaven, not super, but it's like a realm of pure magicka, and it was kind of, it's where the Magna G went, and we're going to talk about the Magna G, or the Magna G? I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it, but again, it's all, you can't see the gestures, it's all written down. And basically, all of the stars and the sun in, like, Elder Scrolls are actually pinpricks kind of views into Aetherius. The light is shining from Aetherius. Excuse me. And that was formed when the Magna G kind of dipped out during the creation of Nirn. And they left a bunch of pinpricks in the sky, basically, and that's where the stars come from and stuff. It's pretty cool. But not the moon. The moon is separate. Anyway, Aetherius is also divided into a bunch of spots, like the Far Shores, which is where the Red Guards go when they die, and Sovngarde, which we saw in Skyrim. That's a piece of Aetherius. That's where the Brave Nords go when they die. And then we got Oblivion, or Oblivion, etc. A bunch of realms ruled by various immortal Daedric princes and catered to suit their vibe. Kind of like a bunch of different hells, but not really. Just like the Daedra are demons, but not really. Basically, Oblivion is like a bunch of different, like, planes and realms and whatnot that aren't Aetherius or Nirn, and most of them are ruled by 17 Daedric princes, and each one kind of has their own realm suited to their needs. And the thing is, basically, they can change parts to suit their needs, but they cannot create new things. Only the Aedra can create, and we'll discuss that, but the Daedra can't. So they have their own little realms. They're typically associated with various things. I've gone over them in the past. I will briefly touch on their names here, but I'm only really going to cover the main ones, because if I took the time to cover every Daedric prince, we would be here all day, and we're already going to be here a lot of the fucking day. Because there's a lot to cover. And I'm going to definitely go through that water a few times before this is done. Anyway, so that's the scoop with Oblivion. Also, people can go there when they die. Typically, if you make a deal with a Daedric prince, you go there. You go to their realm when you die, or if, like, your soul gets stolen by them. Like, for instance, where all werewolves go to Hircine's hunting grounds. Hircine is the Daedric prince of the hunt. Daedra sitting in front of an art tablet crying. Basically. Like, he's the Daedric prince of the hunt, and he created werewolves, and all werewolves go to the hunting grounds when they die, because their souls belong to him. That sort of thing. Also, yeah, they can't die. You can kind of destroy them, but they just go back into the void, and they'll eventually emerge again, but it could take hundreds of thousands of years. We don't know for sure. So now we get to talk about my boy. We got to talk about my boy Lorkhan. my favorite character in lore, aka Shor, aka Shazar, aka the Missing God. If you remember all of the talk about Shor in Skyrim and whatnot, because they worship Shor, and we'll get into why some do and some hate him. So basically, Sithis, just like Anuiel created Oriel, Sithis created, or at least like birthed, Lorkhan, aka Shor, aka Shazar, blah blah. I'm just gonna go with Lorkhan for the sake of simplicity. Yeah, Shor's bones, etc. Also, like, Shor is in charge of Aetherius and also the head of their Pantheon, but sure, I've seen a number of people who didn't know Shor and Lorkhan are the same person. They are, well, God. So basically, he either tricked or convinced some of the Aedra into making Nirn and giving up their immortality. So, like, basically, Aedra means our ancestors, and Daedra means not our ancestors. They're elven terms. And basically, the Aedra are the divines that created Nirn with Lorkhan's help. And some started to help, but noped out partway through because they realized it would mean giving up their immortality, and those were the Magna G, or the Magna G, the ones that dipped. They were led by a dude named Magnus. He was the one who created the sun. No, they're not angels or demons. So yeah, basically the divines, as we know them, are planets circling Nirn, like Arkay, Akatosh, etc. are planets. Because after using so much of their power to create Nirn, they lost their immortality and became semi-comatose, and that's why they're like the planets. There's also another one up there called Manamarco, but oh boy, that would be a whole other thing. We can talk about that when we talk about Dragon Breaks. Anyway, so the elves don't like him because they think, they wanted to stay, oops. Hey, Roni. They wanted to stay immortal. They wanted to stay as the Etada, which were kind of like the immortal spirits and whatnot that everybody was before all of Nirn stuff. And basically, well, I'll touch briefly on them. And the thing is, the elves don't like him because they think they gave up their immortality. They believe they were part of something called the Old Alma Fae, which are the most connected to the gods and also destined to be immortal. And humans are part of the Wandering Alma Fae, who kind of abandon their Alma Faic, I guess, vibe, and end up like becoming mortals and whatnot and separating themselves from the Aedra. That is, of course, the elven interpretation of it. Humans view it differently, because that view's kind of mean to humans. They like Lorkhan because they think humans exist because of him, because of Shor, Shazar, and whatnot. And we've got a whole slide about that. And so that's, Shor and Shazar and whatnot. Now, Lorkhan is not around anymore. hence the missing god. Out of all of, like, the various gods and whatnot, he is, you know, he's gone. That's why, like, Shor's throne is like, Shor's seat in Sovngarde is empty. I'm just stretching. That sort of thing. And there are still ways that his influence is felt. For one, the moons are probably his body, because he was torn apart, and we're gonna explain what's up with that. And also, every now and then, there'll be somebody who kind of carries his energy, his vibes, called the Shezerin. And that we'll get more into Shezerin stuff later, but stuff like, we've touched on Pelinal, he was a Shezerin. And we're going to talk about Pelinal more later when we get to the Elysian Revolution. And he's also connected with the Prisoner in these sort of prophecies about the way that the world works in the Elder Scrolls universe. Of all the days to have a cough. And so that's, like, for instance, why every Elder Scrolls game, except Daggerfall for some reason, you start as a prisoner. That's, like, it's a whole thing. Anyway, so I mostly went over this, so I'm just gonna, like, you know. So, like I said, the elves believe that that Lorkhan tricked the divines and made the Elnathay mortal because he's evil. And so Auriel / Akatosh, the head of the divines, they call him Auriel, humans call him Akatosh, and a few other things, but we'll get to that. So they weren't a huge fan of this, and so they made this tower called the Adamantine Tower, also later called the Dureni Tower. When the Dureni elves took over, we'll briefly touch on the Dureni. And the gods held a big council to figure out what to do about this Lorkhan guy, because they were pretty pissed at him. So they ended up deciding to tear him to pieces and rip out his heart. But, as it said, when they tried to destroy his heart, it laughed at them and said, "This heart is the heart of the world, for one exists to satisfy the other." So basically, they couldn't destroy his heart without destroying Nirn, and since they are so wrapped up in Nirn, it wouldn't work. So instead, Auriel attached it to an arrow and shot it as far away as possible, which honestly actually isn't super far if you look at the geography of Tamriel. But, and it landed, and there was a mountain that formed there, and then later on the heart was found by the Tribunal and the Dwemer, blah, 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 blah. I've talked about the Dwemer already, so I'll briefly touch on them, but that's one that, like, we've already covered, and I don't want to go over and over again, because we have enough to get through as it is. Anyway, so the humans, though, they think that Shor / Caesar made Nirn to help mortals be born by either tricking or convincing the Aedra to help out and thus create a mortal plane. Auriel / Akatosh still killed his ass, though. Hate it when my enemy's heart laughs at me. Classic. Okay. I've discussed these already. I'm not going to spend too much time on them, but we do have to cover the basics of the various races of Tamriel. Again, we're going to do like a lightning round here. So the Altmer are the High Elves. They're like the tall yellow ones. they're really snooty and kind of think they're superior to everybody else. They're the ones that firmly believe they're descended directly from the gods and are destined for immortality, blah, 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 blah. You probably know them best as the Thalmor from the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. They run their whole other empire down in the southwest that emerged during the Fourth Era, but that's not really relevant to Vigilant, so we discussed it already, so I'm not going to go too in-depth about it. But they were the first elves, and they live in a spot kind of off the southwestern coast of Tamriel called the Somerset Isles. They originally came from a continent called Aldmeris, but the continent was kind of lost, in part because they believe due to the interference of the creation of mortality, so they're kind of mad at the humans, but it's entirely possible that Aldmeris never existed, but that's a whole other thing. Anyway, they think mortality's a mistake, and the Altmer kind of want to end the world as a result, but that's neither here nor there. Now, some of the elves didn't like the Altmer kind of choosing to venerate the divines and no other ancestors. And so at one point, Veloth, this elf, received this kind of revelation from a couple Daedric princes, mainly Boethia, and we'll get into that, that basically he decided to leave, and the group that left was called the Chimer. And later they became the Dunmer when the Tribunal stole the power of the heart, and Sothasil made fun of Azura and she cursed them all. So, whatever. They originally worshipped the Tribunal, which was Almalexia, Sothasil, and Vivek, who were three mortals who found the heart of Lorkhan after all the Dwemer tried to use it to make a giant god robot and disappeared. And they used the tools to become sort of living gods and ruled over Dunmer society for thousands of years. Some people think they're really cool. I think they're really not, because throughout most of that time they allowed slavery of Argonians, which we've talked about, so... Anyway, they died in Morrowind when the Nerevarin, reincarnation of Indoril Nerevar, I'm not even touching that one. That's a whole other can of worms. Sort of destroyed the heart, but not really. Destroyed it on the mortal plane, but it's still kind of out there as, vibes. Anyway, after the Tribunal dipped, at the start of the Fourth Era, this giant floating city crashed into Red Mountain, the giant volcano in Morrowind that was, hey, Tragedian. That was where the heart landed. It erupted and destroyed a fucking, huge chunk of Morrowind, where the Dunmer live, and completely, fucked up their society. That's why there's all those refugees in Skyrim and whatnot, and why Skyrim and the Empire gave them, I'm blanking on the name of the island, the place where Dragonborn takes place, not the Silmarillion, that's the book. How am I blanking? Solstheim, thank you. I have too much stuff in my head. It's hard to keep track of. But yeah, that's what's up with the Dunmer. I'm going to try to speed through the rest of these. The Bosmer are the Wood Elves. They live in Valenwood in southwestern Tamriel. They're the ones who have the Green Pact. I already discussed that. But they worship the spirit called Ifre or Ifa, depending on who you ask. Or Yefre, I'm just going to use Ifre. Who, like, gave them form because they came from something called the Ooze and were constantly, like, shape-shifting and whatnot on something called the Wild Hunt. And so Ifre kind of gave them form, which is why they're not as big on the whole hating mortality thing. Ifre kind of gave them form, and they're goo dudes, it's true. Ifre gave them a form under this thing called the Green Pact, which basically says, like, they can't harm the forest or plant life at all, so, like, their houses are, like, made of, like, leather and bone and stuff, and so is their, like, clothing and weapons and whatnot. And they don't, like, they're basically anti-vegan, they don't eat plants. They don't fuck with the natural order. They will eat animals and stuff. And some of those animals include themselves. They are cannibals. Granted, not all of them, but, like, all the ones in Valenwood they're cannibals. They eat each other when they die. Just because that's, part of returning to the natural order. It's not considered, like, a bad thing. People outside of Valenwood think it's kind of fucked up, but yeah, they all eat each other. Like, when they have a big battle or whatnot, the victors throw a big feast with all the dead bodies, and they eat them. So that's, like, a thing, and it's fine. Their biology's fine with it. They have all of this other really weird shit going on. Like, if somebody murders a family member, they kidnap a family member of the murderer's family and force them to assume the role of whoever died. It's insane. They also have these people called spinners, which kind of, like, read fate, but that's more of an ESO thing. Okay, orcs, aka the Orsimer, because they're elves. They're green. They used to be, like, traditional elves, but who worshipped this god called Trinimac, who's one of Akatosh's buddies. Depending on who you believe, Akatosh and Lorkhan had, like, a big war to determine the fate of Nirn, and Lorkhan lost. Pretty evidently. And they followed Trinimac, who was kind of like Akatosh's right hand during the big war. And so when the Chimer decided to leave the Somerset Isles, Trinimac tried to stop them, and Boethia, the Daedric prince, ate Trinimac. And upon eating Trinimac, transformed him to be diplomatic in my speech. Transformed him into Malakath, the Daedric prince of, like, revenge and curses. And all of his followers were turned into the Orsimer, or orcs. And they have had a time and a half. They have historically just gotten the absolute shit kicked out of them throughout history. They had, like, they're the only ones who don't have, like, a country. In Tamriel, they have had, like, a place called Orsinium, but Orsinium has gotten sacked and destroyed so many times that most of them are just kind of nomadic now. You'll see them living in those kind of, like those little, like, holds, the little, the places in Elder Scrolls. Anyway, they got a super raw deal, and people treat them like shit. The Orc Strongholds, thank you. My brain is just gone. Anyway, the Nords. I'm gonna speed through these. Nords, the Skyrim natives, they came from Atmora, the place to the north, and the Atmorans interbred with the Needs, who were the native people of Tamriel, and became the Nords. The Needs are gone now, and we'll briefly touch on that. They follow, like, their own pantheon. Like, they worship the Nine Divines, but they also revere Shor, as I've mentioned, and they view Akatosh as Alduin, which we learn in Skyrim is not necessarily the case, but they have their whole old thing. They're really anti-elf. They have been since they came from Atmora, and so there's a lot of anti-elf racism over there. I mean, you know it best from the Stormcloaks, who just... Boy, they hate them elves, huh? They don't care for them elves at all. They're the ones who I think we at least need to talk about, because we played Skyrim. Anyway, the Imperials are the ones who live in Cyrodiil in the middle of Tamriel. They're the ones we're going to be focusing on the most during this presentation. And they're kind of like a blend of other of other races. They are humans, but mixed with others. And originally it was divided into two countries, the Colovians and the Nibonese. But when, when the Empire took over, they became Imperials, and they have been at war and have been the seat of the Empire for thousands of years, various different empires, because in the middle is the White Gold Tower, which is this big tower, pretty much like, if there's an emperor, he lives there, or she, or they. I shouldn't assume. And, they are, they're the side that Skyrim, that the, Stormcloaks are opposing in the Civil War, because that's where, the current Cyrodiilic Empire operates out of. Where all the Shive emperors, we're going to get to that, actually. So that's what's up with the Imperials. They're the ones in the middle. If you hear any mentions of Colovian or Nibonese, those are Imperials, and a lot of stuff goes down. Cyrodiil is where Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion takes place. The Red Guards are maybe my favorite race in the series, but aren't super relevant to this, so we're not going to talk about them a ton. They came from a continent called Yokuda to the west of Tamriel, which they sank through probably use of nuclear weapons. It's complicated. Anyway, they landed in Hammerfell, the part of a peninsula to the northwest, in the northwest of Tamriel. And they originally arrived as the Regatta, which means warrior wave is where Red Guards came from, because they basically came there and they just kind of swept through it, killed off everybody who was there, and took over. And they kick ass. Basically, they consistently absolutely kick so much ass. They had this stuff called Sword Singers. It's cool as fuck. They have a separate kind of religion involving Satakal, which is kind of like this religion that kind of blends Akatosh and Sithis and a bunch of stuff. I'll go into it later, but it's really cool and it's very different. And during the big war with the Thalmor, they just kind of beat the Thalmor up, and when the Empire surrendered, or not surrendered, but made a deal with the Thalmor the Redguard just kind of said no and declared independence and just beat the Thalmor's ass so hard that they gave up on trying to conquer it. So currently Hammerfell is independent from the Empire. So that's what's up with them. The Bretons, we are going to discuss the ones that have been mentioned as being the kind of boring ones. Oh yeah, Redguards are dudes rock. A lot of people view them as kind of boring, which I feel bad for them, but they're humans that are part elf. They're in High Rock. Basically, High Rock used to be ruled by this group of elves called the Dureni. They were Altmer, they weren't like a separate race, but heyo. So they were yeah, I feel bad for the Bretons too. The Manmer, yes. There's a debate over whether they're men or mer, but are generally considered to be humans. And so the Dureni that used to rule over High Rock kind of interbred with the native Nedic population. I mentioned the Needs when I talked about the other ones, the ones that aren't around anymore. And that resulted in the Bretons. And the Bretons have this kind of more traditional, like feudal, like Middle Ages feudal, like king system. Yeah, Daggerfall was set in High Rock. High Rock is directly to the east, also on the same peninsula as Hammerfell. And them and the Redguards have had some conflicts. They've also had some conflicts with the Orcs, but they're also one of the few parts that are still remaining as part of the Empire as of Skyrim. Now, the Bretons and the fall of the Dureni actually figure heavily into the stuff we are going to be... Yeah, there's a new DLC for ESO called High Isle, and which is ESO original. I would love to cover lore from it, but I cannot afford to get the DLC, so I am not super up on my lore from it. Maybe someday when I can actually afford to get expansions or do ESO Plus or anything. That shit's fucking expensive. Anyway, the Khajiit we've talked about a lot. They're cats. They live in elsewhere, like in the western part of Tamriel. They're all about like the moon, or moons, because there are two moons that may be Lorkhan's body, but debatable. Anyway, there's actually 17 different types of Khajiit, mostly cats, but of varying sizes. Like I think the Cathay are the ones that we see the most in Skyrim. But there's also like the Sentia, like ones that are like tiger-sized big, and there's also the Alfiq, which are basically house cat-sized Khajiit, but like they fully have the intelligence and stuff of like human-sized Khajiit, which is fucking awesome. But that's, they also have this whole other set of lore in which Lorkhan is referred to as Lorkaj, and is typically a villainous figure. And they believe in this lunar lattice thing. They're like that one cat from Dark Souls 2, like Shao Kwa, indeed. They travel a lot. Like, you run into Khajiit caravans and stuff. Yeah, Lorkaj is their third moon, or the Dark Moon. Heyo. Shout out to my homies. And generally connected to Namira, who doesn't figure into many creation stories except for the Reachmen, which we're not going to do the Reachmen. That's a whole other thing. And so they like to travel in caravans a lot, and they do have this problem with, sometimes going crazy, but that's something we're more going to touch on in Glenmoral, so I'm just going to leave it alone. If the Khajiit uses a sword, are they a Blade of the Dark Moon? I mean, maybe. Depends on who they fight for. Argonians are lizards, but actually trees that come from the Hist. I'm not really going to go over them too much because I've gone over them the most in this playthrough. But they come from the Hist. They're the only ones that didn't come from elves or men. Like, they weren't Etata at all. Like, the Hist were just a thing. Like, the sentient trees, and they created the Argonians, so they're very unique. They also generally have a more positive relationship with Sithis, where they view him less as evil and more as a deity of change. And change is, like, an important part of life, so they're more cool with it. They were enslaved by the Dunmer for a while. And during the neither elf nor man, but a secret third thing. And during the Oblivion Crisis, they kicked Mehrunes Dagon's ass so hard that they actually went and invaded the Deadlands and made serious headway. That's Mehrunes Dagon's Plane of Oblivion. Mehrunes is Daedric Prince of Destruction, my second favorite Daedric Prince, and we're not going to be talking about him because we have so much to talk about already. We're probably not even going to get to Vigilant today. Good God. Anyway. That's true. So, yeah, they were slaves to the Dunmer, and then when the Red Mountain thing happened to the Dunmer, they actually invaded Morrowind and claimed a bunch of it, which I honestly think that's fair. After the centuries of slavery, I think that was fine. I think they had the right. Okay. So, we're finally off that slide. It only took us like a half hour. Anyway, Tamrielic history has been split into eras. The first era is the Dawn era, which was kind of like the end of the previous Kalpa. We talked about Kalpas, but basically the universe kind of goes through these cycles every now and then, like when Alduin eats the world and basically time starts over again and pretty much everything gets shuffled up. Gods can be changed to be completely different things, to be gods of different things, to be mortals, whatever. Everything shifts around. And the Dawn era was kind of like the formation of the current Kalpa, or Kalpa, depending on who you ask. And that was followed by the Merethic era, which is this, where it was a whole thing. We're not really going to be touching on it that much. But that was kind of when stuff really settled down, like with the Etata and the Elnathay and stuff. The stuff I've already touched on. The first era was when these societies really began to form. That's when, like, the Dwemer and the Chimer broke off, and the Atmorans became the Nords, all the main stuff, and the first era is the one we're going to be covering the most, because most of the lore from Vigilant is about the first era, and the Alessian Empire and Alessian Order, and we're going to talk about Alesia. Just know that I'm going to get to it. The second era was marked by the end of the Reman Empire, which we're not even going to touch on much. We touched on it with Serana already, so I'm not gonna get to it too much. And that had a whole era where Tamriel was ruled by these, or at least Cyrodiil was ruled by these Akaviri potentates, that came from Akavir, the continent to the east, and a lot of them were a race called the Saesi, who are super interesting because we don't know what they looked like. They're called snake-like, but we don't know exactly what they look like, which is really funny, since they influenced Tamriel for hundreds of years. Anyway, The second era after that ended gave way to the Interregnum, which was this giant period of chaos of everybody trying to fight over who was going to be in charge and whatnot. And during that era is when the events of the Three Banners War, aka Elder Scrolls Online, take place. In the middle of all that. So if you're wondering about Elder Scrolls Online, there you go. That's when it was. Hundreds upon hundreds of years before the rest of the games. Which probably makes sense, because that way they could they could fuck around with canon a lot more easily. The second era ended when Tiber Septim conquered all of Tamriel. We've discussed Tiber Septim, aka Talos, and we'll discuss it a bit more further. And then the third era is when all of the games before Skyrim take place. It was the era ruled by the Septim dynasty, which is technically still in charge, but significant. Well, now it's the Mede dynasty, but that era ended when the last Septim, Martin Septim, turned into Akatosh and died at the end of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. So the fourth era started after that, and the fourth era is when Skyrim takes place. It's what's going on right now. Right, literally as we speak. The war is going on. It's just raging. That's when, like, the Thalmor and the Aldmeri Dominion came to power. There was some fighting over the throne. Eventually, the Mede dynasty took over. They aren't super important. That's when the Great War happened that led to the White Gold Concordat, all that stuff, and that's where we're currently at. And now we're gonna get to the important stuff, the Vigilant stuff, and we're gonna start with the Aelids, and oh my god, we have so many slides left. Holy moly, we are not even a third of the way through this thing. Before we continue, I'm just gonna go grab some water really quick because the air in here is very dry and my throat is gonna explode. So I will be back momentarily. I'm not even gonna throw up the BRB thing. It's gonna take like 2 seconds. Anyway, we're gonna talk about the Aelid Empire. The Aelids were a race of elves, also called the Wild Elves. They are not around anymore, and we're gonna talk about why. They ruled over Cyrodiil, the main place. They built the White Gold Tower that everything takes place out of. The Imperial, like the big tower in the Imperial City in Oblivion, that was them. They did that. They built this big tower, and they worshipped a version of the Divines, not the 9 Divines. Talos wasn't a thing until the end of the second era. But they worshipped the Divines, but they also did Daedra worship, which was a big thing separating them from other elves. Well, the Dunmer kind of did Daedra worship, but it was a very different thing. The main one they venerated was Meridia, my personal favorite Daedric prince, who we're going to talk about. But basically, they, like, out of the basic elements, like fire, water, air, and dirt, fucking magnets, how do they work, blah, blah, blah. They viewed light as an element, and her as, you know, she's the Daedric prince of light and life, so they were big on her. And she would even send some of her Daedric dudes to defend them sometimes, called the Aurorans, but we'll talk about them. Some of them also, however, worshipped Molag Bal, our arch enemy, who we're going to touch on more briefly, but we've talked about Molag Bal. He, unfortunately, is one you have to know about for Vigilant, because he's the main villain, as we've established. Anyway, the Aelids also... Yeah, I need to have just, like, a loud boo whenever his name shows up, or just, like a censoring beep. Boo, I hate that guy. We hate him. We do. The Aelids also did a lot of slavery. Specifically, they enslaved humans, namely the Needs, who would eventually become the Imperials, Nords, Bretons, blah, blah, blah. And, most of the humans in Cyrodiil, they didn't really fuck with the Nords much because they were doing their own thing. They had dragons to fight and shit. But they had this, this empire built on slave labor. And the thing is, like, the reason that I'm putting the slavery element more prominently than I was with the Dunmer is, excuse me, I have to cough. Follow and subscribe for more of me spending hours working on a presentation and then having my voice give out partway through. Anyway, their slavery was really, really bad. Like, I'm gonna spare you a fair amount of the gory details, but unfortunately we do have to talk about one very gory detail, which is the flesh arts and the gut gardens. Already some red flags there. But, the Aelids, not all of them, hashtag not all Aelids, but a lot of them practiced the flesh arts, which was they would take, Needs and humans and make art out of their flesh. They would kill them and make art pieces with them. The gut gardens being like these big grand exhibits made of human guts and gore. It was bad. It was really, really bad. The Aelids were not. They were pretty fucking bad. Definitely don't wanna hang out with them. They were so bad, in fact, that the humans eventually had enough. And so this woman, that's right, girl boss alert, Alesia, later known as the Slave Queen, started obviously was a slave, started a revolution against the Aelids. And she, started fighting against them by making this, human army alongside her good pal / eventually consort / husband Morihaus, who was a Minotaur. Yeah, she married and had kids with a Minotaur, so good for her. They're like sentient and intelligent, so it's not weird. It's fine. I mean, typically humans don't have kids with Minotaurs, but she did a lot. She has the right. Anyway, they started going ham, but the Aelids were obviously a lot stronger, and so she prayed to Akatosh for help. Good for her. And she prayed to the gods in general for help. Oh, I almost forgot. Actually, no, we'll circle back to the Amulet of Kings. Just know that the Aelids made the Amulet of Kings, and we'll get to the Amulet of Kings later. So she prayed for help, and the gods sent down Mr. Pelinal Whitestrake, the big star of the Knights of the Nine DLC, and probably one of the characters that people love the most, despite him doing some very, very bad things. But, people love Pelinal. He was a Shezeran. I discussed Shezerans briefly. He came down from the heavens with his fucking laser arm, and he was insane. He was basically a demigod, and he just started chopping his way through everything, and he was pretty intense. He would go on these giant rampages and just slaughter through people. There was this one point where he was chewing on the neck of an Aelid general, and while doing it screamed out Riemann, the name of somebody who would eventually become emperor like hundreds of years later. He was wild. He was also gay. Fun fact, so some gay rights stuff going on. He was gay. There was a hoplite named Huna who was in Alessia's army who he fell in love with, and they were a couple. And sort of when he would go crazy, Huna was kind of the only one who could calm him down. He would freak out, and Huna would be like, babe, stop. OMG, for real, stop. Also, sometimes straight up the gods would come down to tell him to knock it off. But mostly it was Huna. Unfortunately, since, we can't have fucking anything in this world, Huna got killed. He got killed in a battle, and Pellinol fucking lost it. Like, he was already crazy, but he lost it. Like, he went out and he slaughtered cities by himself, men, women, and children. He wiped them out. He started killing anything elven he could see. He even fucking went so crazy that he started slaughtering the Khajiit, who aren't even elves. To the point where, again, the gods had to come down and be like, you gotta stop. You gotta stop. So there's a book in the Song of Pellinol called On His Madness, and it describes him, not just the men, but also the women. And the children, too. They were like animals, and he slaughtered them like animals. So he kind of went nuts, but obviously Alesia was winning that fucking war with him on her side. She won that fucking war. However, the Aelids, all the other gods looking at Akatosh, like, oh yeah, he had that whole Achilles, Alexander the Great, Reinhard von Lohengrin kind of vibe for sure. Anyway, the Aelids had like a champion, a semi-demigod, a champion blessed by Meridia called Umariel the Unfeathered. He was a fucking dick. Like, all the gut garden stuff, he was huge on that. He had just a whole thing. He was real bad. And he was the guardian of... Man, one of those things was not like the others. I don't know what you're talking about. Anyway, I genuinely don't know what you're talking about, sorry. Anyway, Umariel was kind of the last line of defense in the White Gold Tower. And he fought, basically, Alesia was like, okay, we gotta lay siege to the tower, because we're gonna have to push our way through, and if we just run in there, Umariel and all of his various other kings will just kill the shit out of us. Like, we gotta wait. And Pellinol was like, fuck no. They killed my lover, my boyfriend. They killed my hubby, Huna. And so I'm not waiting. And so he fucking went in there, and he and Umariel had a big old fight. And he killed Umariel. But then all of the other Aelid kings kind of descended on him since he was gravely wounded. And he was chopped into pieces. And died. R.I.P. Pellinol. You were genocidal, but you were also gay. So it's impossible to say whether he was good or not, because he was, up and down. Oh yeah, the Divines almost abandoned Alesia and her armies. Yeah, they had to come down there and be like, you gotta knock it off, or we're not gonna help you. You gotta stop. You really have to stop. And so then, when once that was all over, Alesia kind of took charge. So the first human emperor was actually a woman. So girl boss, extreme girl boss alert. Anyway, she sort of started this new empire. Her and Morahouse had this kid Belharza, which we're going to talk about later. And Alesia was awesome. There are a lot of problematic faves throughout Elder Scrolls lore. Alesia was pretty much just straight up great. Like, sure, she wasn't perfect. She let Pelennor do a lot, but like overall, she's an unproblematic fave, believe it or not. She was awesome. Elder Scrolls is, yeah. So she came there, and upon taking power, she got the Amulet of Kings. We're going to talk about that. Also known as the Kim El Adabal, or Chim El Adabal, which is basically like the red stone of god blood, and it was made into a gem by the Aelids, and it's formed from the blood of Lorkhan. And it's super powerful, and it's a big deal. And it was given to Alesia by Akatosh or by Shazar. The lore is contradictory because basically, the Alessians wrote the history books, and they wanted to have like a united empire, and so they didn't want to piss off the elves too much. So the claim is that it was given to her by Akatosh, but it's entirely possible it was given to her by Shazar. It's also complicated though, because Shazar was, dead at the same time, but it's, it is the symbol of empire. Like, it is the big deal. Like, having that means that you are legit. Although it did eventually get... eventually the Alessian Empire lost it, and it was found by Riemann Cyrodiil, which is a whole other thing. And it ultimately was destroyed at the end of the Third Era when Martin Septim smashed it to mantle Akatosh, like sort of take on the power of Akatosh briefly, and then died. So our first giant block quote for this, from the book Trials of St. Alesia. I'm blocking it a bit, but just trust me. So from that, Akatosh drew from his breast a burning handful of his heart's blood, and he gave it into Alesia's hand, saying, "This shall also be a token to you of our joined blood and pledged faith. So long as you and your descendants shall wear the Amulet of Kings, then shall this dragonfire burn in eternal flame as a sign to all men and gods of our faithfulness. So long as the dragonfire shall burn, to you and to all generations, I swear that my heart's blood shall hold fast the gates of oblivion." God, yeah, Martin was a real one. God rest. He was fucking great. Anyway, so basically the dragonfires and the amulet meant that the Daedra couldn't show up. Like, the Daedra couldn't fuck around with Nirn too much. They still could a bit, but, And so the descendants of Alesia had to wear it as part of this covenant. However, the descendants don't necessarily have to be blood-related. Like, for instance, Tiber Septim is not blood-related to Alesia, as far as we know. I mean, maybe. But he doesn't really look like much of a cow. That actually sounded mean. That sounded like I was calling her a cow. He doesn't look much like a minotaur. She's not a cow. She's wonderful. She just had a cow for a husband. And don't get me wrong, I love Morahouse. He was also a cow. Anyway, follow and subscribe for more cow marriage lore. That's my first time doing a follow and subscribe this whole time. You should be proud of me. And so, basically, if you can wear the Amulet of Kings, then it's kind of like you're worthy of being the Emperor. It was like a signifier, although now it's gone. but, you know. So when Alesia took over and made her whole thing, she made the Alessian Pantheon of the 8, eventually 9, divines. And basically, they are kind of like the compromise gods, if you will. They're kind of an amalgamation of multiple different gods. Like, for instance, Akatosh is also Auriel, but Alesia didn't want to call him Auriel because she knew the Nords would never get behind that. That's also why Shor/Shazar is not part of the 8 divines, because she knew the elves would never get behind it. She was very diplomatic and very smart and very perfect, and we love Alesia here. What are you doing? Cat's causing trouble. So it's kind of, it's kind of like an amalgamation. However, they do exist because Elder Scrolls lore is one of those things where things exist if you believe in them, kind of like Tinkerbell, but like God. And it's just like Tinkerbell, but God. Where if, enough people believe in them, they exist and are in the form that people believe. That's why the Thalmor want to eradicate Talos worship, because if people stop worshipping him, he'll stop being a god, but neither here nor there. Wasn't the Emperor also a Dragonborn? Yeah, the Septim bloodline were all Dragonborn. So technically, like, if the Amulet of Kings was still around, the protagonist of Skyrim would probably be able to wear it. And because the whole Dragonborn thing came from Akatosh, that's why it's Dragonborn, because he's the dragon god of time. So we're just going to touch on them. Just, again, all of these have 10 million different names. Some are specifically relevant to the mod and Skyrim, so I'm going to briefly touch on them, but not all of them. So Akatosh is the dragon god of time, also called Alduin or Auriel, and he's like the head of all of the gods, chief enemy of Lorkhan, and yeah, time is his domain. He like literally created time. That's when the eras started and stuff, because Akatosh just created time. Hey Bella, going good. We're going over the divines. We just finished talking about the Alessian Revolution. So Akatosh, I mean, we've touched on him. Arkay is the god of death and rebirth. He's the god of death, but a lot more sympathetic than that. There's some theories that he was once a human mortal who ascended to godhood, but that's only like briefly touched on by like 3 things, so I'm not gonna go too into it. He hates Molag Bal. Oh yeah, don't worry, I am about to tear into Arkay. I have beef with him. Oh, of course. He hates Molag Bal because Molag Bal made vampires. And basically, vampires were created because Molag Bal wanted to piss off Arkay. And we've talked about LeMay. I'm gonna have to touch on LeMay again briefly because obviously it's a touchy subject, but kind of important for Vigilant. Kind of very important. Anyway, LeMay was a priestess of Arkay, and when she got and turned into the first vampire by Molag Bal, Arkay abandoned her, despite her life of service, unfailing service to him. When she became the first vampire, he abandoned her, and as such, I'm personally not a big fan. I think that was very much a dick move, and it's more like he was embarrassed that Molag Bal beat him and wasn't willing to help her, so me and RK, we got beef. On a lighter note, Dibella. She is the goddess of art and desire, also, like, the goddess of, like, sex, but, you know, I'm keeping it PG-13, minus the swears. She's also associated with the feminine divine, and she's viewed negatively by some as just being kind of like a promiscuous god, blah blah blah. She's nice though. She also has gay temples. She has temples specifically devoted to women, where all the priestesses are women, and some of the, you know, Dibellan arts are sexual in nature, and since they're performed by all women, you know, she got gay temples, and that's pretty cool. Anyway, Stendarr. Obviously, Stendarr's important. We're a Vigilant of Stendarr. That's the mod's called Vigilant. He's kind of fucking important. He's the god of mercy and justice. Like, he shows mercy to those that, you know, need mercy, and brings justice to those who need justice. Now, however, after the end of the Third Era, this fanatical sect called the Vigilants of Stendarr formed, and basically, Stendarr's not a big fan of Daedra, and, like, vampires and stuff in general, because they're bad. And the Vigilants of Stendarr kind of rose up, and, you know, a little Gamers Rise Up moment, and became this sort of extremist sect who slaughter Daedra and Daedra worshippers, vampires, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, they have a phrase that gets spoken a lot, which is, Stendarr's mercy be upon you, for the vigil has none to spare. You remember, obviously, Altano was the one who wanted you to kill those innocent people, and granted, he was corrupted, but, like, earlier, the dude with the eye who wasn't hurting anybody, he had to die. That sort of thing. They're not great. They're not great. But Stendarr's also viewed as, like, a protector, and generally, just to make sure this is clear, because I was confused about it a while ago, the Vigilance being extremist does not mean Stendarr himself is extremist. They take his stuff very, very far, but it doesn't necessarily line up with his views. Yeah, but that's about going with a Vigilant to deal with an evil house that's possessed by Molag Bal. Well, haunted by Molag Bal. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, Stendarr good, Vigilance morally questionable, you could say. Mara is the goddess who appears in, I think, the most religions out of, like, all of the various religions, sometimes called, like, Morwa and stuff, but always Mara. She's the goddess of love and marriage. Like, Dibella's also the goddess of love, but that's more in, like a general love sort of sense. Mara's, like, marital love. She's also the god of childbirth, and, you know, if, obviously, the way you get married in Skyrim is you, wear the Amulet of Mara, which signals, like, hey, ladies, I'm available, and people get married in the temples of Mara, blah, blah, blah. And basically, everybody likes her. She's pretty much always regarded as positive in every religion, and she's the least controversial of the bunch. Then Kinnereth is an adaptation of Kine. That's another one that you will hear a lot in Skyrim. Kine in Nordic religion is the wife of Shor, and supposedly created humans by breathing life into them at the throat of the world. Has anyone ever had issues with I'm sure people have, I'm sure, but no major ones. But, Kinnereth has had a very changing role over the years as a result. She is also the one who taught humans the voice, or at least, told Parthenax to teach them the voice. That's why there's all the talk about the breath of Kine and Kine's peace, blah, blah, blah. Kine is Kinnereth. She's also the goddess of nature and weather, and also Kinnereth is separate from Kine because, clap your hands if you believe Tinkerbell, blah, 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 blah. But the current was the goddess of nature and weather. Her role has changed over the years. She's an enemy of Hircine because werewolves are unnatural, go against nature, blah, blah, blah. But she's a complicated one. We're going to talk about her more in depth and how she ties into the Nordic Pantheon, since Kine is Kine's a big deal. Then there's Zenithar, who's typically depicted as being buds with Kinnereth. He's the god of trade and commerce, patron of craftsmen, and there just isn't a lot on him. He's not mega interesting, he's not mega relevant, but he's just, he's like the god of commerce and work. You know the drill. Julianos, the god of wisdom and magic. In the Nordic Pantheon, he's Junal. And Junal, boy, are we going to talk about Junal. That's a separate thing. Also, Julianos is kind of a fusion of Junal and an elven god called Finaster. And he's like the patron of mages, but he's had a bunch of different roles in different cultures. He's even like the god of like ransoms and stuff in Nordic mythology. It's a whole thing, but his name is also he's also named after a dev. Like his name comes from like a person who worked on the original called Julian. But then there's Talos, who we've talked about in depth. He was not part of the Alessians, but he's part of the Nine Divines that we know now. He was formerly a man. He was Tiber Septim, who united all of Tamriel using a giant robot. Blah, blah, blah. And, there's the big war over whether or not he's a god. There's also the possibility that he achieved divinity by mantling Lorkhan, by kind of, like, taking Lorkhan's energy in Lorkhan's spot. But that's a subject of that's a matter of debate. Okay, we're gonna speed. I keep saying we're gonna speed through these, and we are very much not speeding through them. So I touched on the Alessian Empire, obviously. The Alessian Empire eventually became the Alessian Order, which is the big thing in Vigilant that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about very soon. And a bunch of stuff happened that led to the Alessian Order collapsing. And then there was a bunch of chaos until Riemann Cyrodiil, another guy, took over and made his own empire, which conquered a surprising amount of Tamriel. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And he, he determined his legitimacy because he could wear the Amulet of Kings. He was also Dragonborn, and when the Akaviri invaded in late First Era, the Akaviri invaded, and upon finding Riemann and seeing that he was the Dragonborn, they all bowed down and pledged their loyalty to him. That's why the Akaviri temple has a big old Riemann face in it. Anyway, he and his descendants ruled over for a while, but then one of his kids what would tell us? Oh yeah, he represents like war and conquest. So, kind of since he conquered all of Tamriel and stuff. Anyway, Riemann's family ruled for a while with potentates that were Akaviri, and then Bremen's, I can't remember if it was his grandson or whatever, but one of his descendants got assassinated by the Molag Tong, which is an assassin guild that I'm not even going to fucking get into right now because we have so much. He got assassinated on the orders of Versailles, his potentate, and then when that happened, Versailles took over and declared the end of the First Era, and started the Second Era, which was ruled over by the Akaviri potentates until that shit, like, collapsed, also via assassination by the Morag Tong, and then that led to the Interregnum, which I discussed, and then that ended when Tiber Septim used a big robot called the Numidium, and he united all of Tamriel, and he was the first one that we're aware of that united everything, from the Elves to the Argonians to the Khajiit, everything under one big empire called the Septim Dynasty, or the Septim Empire. That's why the coins are called Septims, named after him. Like, nobody had conquered the Somerset Isles until he brought the big robot over there and threw a bunch of bombs at them until they were like, okay, fine, Jesus, we'll join your empire. And so they ruled for like 400 years or something. There were some wars of succession there, like the War of the Red Diamond, blah, blah, blah. But that all ended when Mankar Cameron and the Mythic Dawn, during the events of Oblivion, assassinated the Emperor and all of his kids, except for Martin Septim, an illegitimate child, because, oh, Uriel Septim, you horn dog. Fucking Patrick Stewart, the horny grandpa. Oh, yeah, because, again, the Dwemer made a giant robot that they were going to turn into a god, and then they fucked up and disappeared, and then the robot was just kind of hanging out. And then when Tiber Septim came to conquer Morrowind, by granting Morrowind semi-autonomy, they gave him the big robot, and he powered it using a thing called the Mantella, which is discussed in Daggerfall, and I'm not even going to remotely get into it. He conquered them with the robot, using the power of the heart. I mean, I personally think they zero-summed, but we've discussed that before. I'll discuss it later. They were going to use the Heart of Lorkhan. Anyway, like, they were going to use the heart as a power source. Anyway, so Martin Septim destroyed the Amulet of Kings to become Akatosh temporarily to stop Mehrunes Dagon from invading Tamriel. And that ended that, and that ended the third, and then that ended the Third Era. And then the Fourth Era, which is where we're at right now, there's kind of shaky foundations. There was a War of Succession, and then eventually the Mede Dynasty took over, which led to the Great War, which gets talked about a lot in Skyrim, so I'm not going to get into it here. But that ended with the White Gold Concordat, which kind of basically a big win for the Aldmeri Dominion and the Thalmor, but it's only temporary. Eventually the Empire is going to come back and come back strong for another war, and that's why you should side with the Empire in Skyrim. There's my official declaration. You should side with the Empire in the Civil War, because they're all going to need to work together if they want to beat the Thalmor. But either way, some people view it as a dying empire. Okay. We're about to get into the real nitty-gritty stuff. We're about to get into the main... We're gonna get into the main thing here. We're gonna get into the main thing this is about, the Alessian Order and the Alessian Empire and a talking monkey. But I have to refill my water again and run to the ladies' room. So talk amongst yourselves, follow and subscribe. I will be back in a couple minutes, and then we will get into the Alessian Order, everybody's favorite fundamentalist empire. Okay, I'll be right back. Hi. Okay, so we're done with the overview stuff. We're finally done with the overview stuff. Now we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty. We're gonna start talking about dates. We're gonna start talking about names. We're gonna start talking about talking monkeys and sideways time. I'm not even kidding. This shit's about to get wild. So we're going to start with a quote from The Illusion of Death about Maruk the Imga, or Maruk. Are the monkeys in the sideways time related? They sure are. Maruk the Imga, which kind of wrote the doctrines that started the whole religion. So we're going to start by reading a little bit about him. Imga are talking monkeys, by the way. You don't really need to know too much about them, but we'll talk about them a bit. Then, because he had toyed with the 8-maiden Dulsa, did Maruk spend his century of penance upon the stone meadows, and his sight was seared, and his tongue was swollen, and his pelt was mottled, and his left thumb pointed ever at the stars of the tower. And ever did the shade of Al-Esh speak to him, Al-Esh being Alesia, serrated words that rasped his concept organ and brought him to wisdom through affliction, and he recorded her words in his simian gore with glyphs on the beseeching scarp, and the fire in his blood did etch the lithic face with the 77 inflexible doctrines. And though the labor depleted, ye even consumed his very substance, he stinted not, for he knew that death is an illusion. For did not Al-Esh persist, speaking knives, though dead? And had not Pelinal been witness to her death, although dead himself at the death of Umaril? Then did Maruk know a right reaching, that one devoted to proper life, and Elnofek annulment, shall persist beyond the illusion of death. For indeed, the drive to expunge corruption can conquer even the arcane cycle. Sorry, I got a little into that. The way I tend to read these lore sources aloud to myself and get very dramatic with them. That was calm for me. Okay, so that was a lot. That was kind of a lot. So I'll summarize with the rise of the Alessian Order, starting with Maruk and the Mandates. That's an Imga, by the way. That's not him. But basically, the Imga are a race of talking monkeys typically found in the jungles of Calovia, which aren't really around anymore. Calovia being part of Cyrodiil. And he was out in the wilderness getting punished for something. And he saw the ghost of Alesia. And she came and talked to him. And he heard her words, and whether or not it was really her is a matter of debate. And it's something discussed in Vigilant, so I'm not going to go too into it. Also, sorry if my dramatic reading was too much. I get excited. And she told him things, and he, since he didn't really have anything else to write with, he used his own blood to write down the 77 inflexible doctrines, or the 77 Alessian doctrines, which put forth a religion that was actually monotheistic, devoted to Akatosh as the one. The other gods are kind of like present, but not as divine, and there's some stuff about Shazar also being divine, but that's a separate thing. And one of the inflexible doctrines that kind of sums up the rest of them is all are guilty until proven innocent. It was a fanatical order that was extremely anti-elf. Like, it was the whole, like, elves are bad, humans are good. Human supremacy over elf is natural. And they took that shit very seriously. They formed, like, essentially a religious dictatorship when sort of the Alessian Order, which was a cult, basically, that followed Maruk's teachings. Not led by Maruk himself, who died, although he apparently lived for, like, hundreds of years. It's unclear. It's also hard to tell because a lot of this stuff was written by the Alessian Order, so some of it's obviously going to be biased. Also, as for why a talking monkey started the religion, I do not know, but it's kind of hilarious. Hang on, my mic... Is my mic working? Because I'm getting a little thing telling me that it's having issues, and if my mic isn't working and I'm speaking to an empty room, I'm going to be so mad. Okay, cool. Excellent. Thank you. So, yeah, basically, some of the Aelids were still around at this point. Like, they'd been kind of beaten up and spread out, but, like, they still had spots where they were living. And they were the target of a lot of the Alessian Order's ire. So, like, for instance, there was one called Malada, which we're going to get into, but, like, for instance, they just went and destroyed entire places. Also, I should mention that, this was not immediately after Alesia died. This was a couple hundred years. There was a group of emperors directly tied to her, the first being Belharza, the man, like, also called Belharza the Man-Bull, because son of her and Morehouse. Although there's some debate about how human versus how bull he was, and we'll get into that. The recent Vigilant update actually discusses this, so I'm not going to get too into it. But Belharza led the first campaign against the Aelids, like destroying the Aelid city of Malada and stuff. Anyway, once the Alessians took over, or the Alessian Order took over, they went and they fucked up Malada real hard again. They went hard. They would go on big old purges and stuff. And so, once they sort of came about and took over, they basically, through, like, various coups and whatnot, and emperors pledging loyalty, the Alessian Empire basically became the Alessian Order. The Alessian Order took over the whole thing. And it was not a good time. The doctrines were dogmatically enforced. It was, theocratic dictatorship. Like, culture stagnated under it because everything was super repressive. There was censorship, blah, 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 and, more massacres of elves, and pretty much anybody who violated the 77 flexible doctrines got put to death. We do not know all of the 77. I am not simply sparing you because that would take forever. We don't actually know all of them. But they, it's a whole thing. So the Cameron dynasty, the Cameron dynasty down in Valenwood were not huge fans of this, and we'll discuss the Camerons at some other time. It's not super relevant here. But basically, they were, not big fans. And so some of the Aelids fled to them. Other Aelids fled to the Dureni, which I talked about when discussing Bretons. The ones that lived up in High Rock, they ruled out of the Dureni Tower, aka the Adamantine Tower, where the first council was convened and shot the heart, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the Nordic Empire was a separate thing, but then King Borgus of the Nordic Empire, are they related to Mankar of Oblivion? Debatably. I'll discuss that. I'm going to do questions at the end, like Q&A at the end. Hopefully you're all following this, by the way. If there's something that's confusing or that you miss, feel free to let me know and I can go back and touch on it again. Anyway, because now we're in the nitty-gritty. So Borgus converted to the Alessian Order, and so the Nords were kind of part of the Alessian Order, but on and off. And in the middle of that order formed a group, like an extra fanatical cult called the Marukati Selectives, who were, they're basically like the mega ultra super extreme fundamentalists. And they were rough. They were, think like Spanish Inquisition, but worse, kind of rough. Like it was bad. And we'll talk about them more later, but it's just worth noting. Now the thing is, despite all of this, they actually had the longest reign of any empire, although their status throughout that reign changed a lot. And we'll discuss that, but shit. Like, they started in 361 and ended in 2321. Nearly 2,000 years of this shit. Which sucks. No wonder Riemann was so beloved. But that time changed around a lot, so we'll deal with that. And then a chunk of the way in, actually only a couple hundred years in, the Bretons had had enough, and they got pretty fucking mad. So we're going to discuss that revolution, that uprising, but I just have another bit of insight into how the Alessian Order operated from a book called Cleansing of the Fane. Here is recorded the events of the year 127 of the Blessed Alesia. Oh yeah, also, the dates are a little contradictory on the when this all happened, but here is recorded the events of the year 127 of the Blessed Alesia. In this year was the day darkened over all lands, and the sun was as if it were Maser being one of the moons, but 3 days old, and the stars about him at midday. This was on the 5th of first seed. All who saw it were dismayed, and said that a great event should come hereafter. So it did, for that same year issued forth a great concourse of devils from the ancient elvish temple Malada. Such had not been seen since the days of King Belharza. Those are elves they're talking about. These devils greatly afflicted the land, such that no man could plow or reap or seed, and all the people appealed to the brothers of Muruk for succor. And then Abbot Cosmas, remember that name, gathered all the brothers and led them to Malada, also known as the High Fane, in the elvish tongue, and came against it with holy fire, and the foul demons were destroyed, and many devilish relics and books found therein were burned, and the land had peace for many years. Which basically translates to, they went to a settlement, burned the whole thing down, killed everyone there, and destroyed all of their history and culture in fire. That's the kind of people we're talking about here. But then, after a while, things started to change. And when things took a turn, they took a turn hard. Now, all of these have specific dates in history associated with them, but I am not going to share them all with you. Not out of malice, but because it would take a really long time, and deep down, I don't think anybody cares. You can look it up. But after a couple hundred years after, like a few hundred years after the Alessian Order kicked off, people had enough. And so This guy known as Rizlav, also known as Rizlav the Righteous, led a rebellion in Western Cyrodiil, because again, the Alessian Order mostly ran Cyrodiil. Led a rebellion, and when the Empire, like when the Alessian Order went to quell it, the Emperor at the time, who was a devout member of the Order, Emperor Garaeus, remember that name, was killed in the rebellion, and that, kind of shook a lot of the faith in the Order, and so pressing their advantage, the Dureni, obviously not huge fan of the Alessian Order, banned the doctrines, and so that led to, the Alessian Order marching on them. And all that came to a head during the Battle of... And this is extremely frustrating because it took place in a place that is spelled differently depending on lore sources, and that's extremely frustrating. There was the Battle of Glenumbra/Glenumbria Moors, where basically the Dureni kind of called upon the Bretons to rise up and fight off the Alessian Order, and they won. the Alessian Order lost. The Dureni and the Bretons came out on top and pushed them back, which was a huge setback that the Alessian Order never fully recovered from. However, the Dureni exhausted themselves so much that led to them losing power in the region, that ultimately led to the Bretons taking power, which leads to the High Rock we know today. So, one of those cool things where events cascade through history. I love stuff like that. It's so interesting, because it's kind of like how the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand led to World War I, led to World War II, led to the Cold War, blah, 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 etc. It's interesting. I think it's cool, okay? I think it's neat. I think it's cool. Anyway, the High King of Skyrim at the time, Ysmir Wolfhearth. Ysmir is also interchangeably used with Talos, but also used to refer to Ysmir Wolfhearth. Like, for instance, in Skyrim that comes up a lot, like Jarl Balin saying, "By Ysmir, Irileth was right." That sort of thing. So Ysmir Wolfhearth banned the doctrines in Skyrim, which also led to Skyrim pulling away from the Alessian Order. So they were in a bad way. And so the Selectives, who I mentioned, decided to do something very, very drastic. But before I tell you what that is, follow and subscribe. No, I'm going to tell you what it is, but follow and subscribe, donate, blah, blah, blah. Pay me for the hours I spent doing this research, because I worked really hard on this, okay? I'm really proud of it. I worked hard. And I posted it in the Vicn Discord server, and they liked it so much to pin it in the lore channel. I'm very proud. Anyway, so we got to talk about Dragon Breaks, something that I've mentioned many times, and people are asking about them because it's just really confusing. So, what is a Dragon Break anyway? Wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. So, the dragon element refers to not like the dragons from Skyrim, but Akatosh, the dragon of natural time, like the dragon god. And basically what happens is something happens, dragon machine broke, that's kind of correct. Basically, mortals fuck around and do something or other, and sort of break slash distort time, which can lead to multiple contradictory outcomes existing at once, can result in time moving in an odd way. It's sometimes referred to as moving sideways. And it's essentially replicating the chaos of the Dawn era, when everything was, like, in flux and whatnot, but only temporarily. And so that's what leads to, for instance, all 7 endings of Daggerfall are canon because a dragon break called the Warp in the West happened, which is why Mana Marco is both a god and not a god. No, dragons in Skyrim are unrelated to dragon breaks. Completely separate thing. I know it's confusing, but it's just about Akatosh. The only time the other dragons get involved is something we see in Skyrim. There's the talk of the Time Wound up at the top of the Throat of the World, which is where you go and read the Elder Scroll. It's called the Time Wound because using the Elder Scrolls, those Nord heroes created a mini dragon break. And doing that was how they sent Alduin forward in time, because they basically broke linear time. So despite Alduin existing, they basically said he didn't exist. But really, they just pushed him forward because time is complicated. But that's what happened with all the dudes yelling on the mountain that one time. That's why it's called the Time Wound. And so the reason I'm bringing this up comes... So first we're going to have to talk about the exclusionary mandates briefly. There's going to be some pretty big quotes here, and they're going to get kind of weird. But this one, the exclusionary mandates are kind of the thing that the Marukati selectives follow, and it is what led them to doing what they do next. The exclusionary mandates of Marukite selection all are equal, so they're all numbered 1 instead of, 1, 2, 3. 1. That the Supreme Spirit Akatosh is of unitary essence, as proven by the monolinearity of time. Time only goes forward, so Akatosh is only one thing. 1. That Shazar, the missing sibling, is singularly misplaced and therefore doubly venerated. So they worshipped him even though they recognized that he's not there. But they were pro-Shazar. They were pro-Lorkhan. That's important to remember. And they were hoping Shazar would eventually return. They believed that he would. 1. That the protean substrate that informs all denial of one is the Aldmeri taint. Meaning that basically the only reason people deny their religion is because of the elves getting in the way and calling him Oriel. 1. That the prophet Most Simeon demonstrated that mono-thought begets proper life. Basically eternal life through believing in the one. 1. That the purpose of proper life is the expungement of the taint. 1. That the arc of time provides the mortal theater for the sacred expungement. And 1. That Akatosh is time, is proper life, is taint death. Basically, the goal of life is to believe in a monotheistic understanding of Akatosh, and the belief in Oriel, which we saw the Snow Elf temple dedicated to Oriel, is their version of Akatosh. But the Marukatis and the Alessian Order believe that Oriel is a separate and heretical thing. Okay, here's where it's gonna get fucking weird. The Marukati selectives and the Middle Dawn dancing on the tower. So this is where shit goes crazy. Basically, the fanatical sect of the Marukati selectives, led by this dude Fervidus Tharn, the archprelate. If the name Tharn sounds familiar, that's connected to Abner Tharn and Clivia Tharn in Elder Scrolls Online. They basically decided, with shit getting all fucked up, with them losing power everywhere, that they were gonna do the thing that they had always wanted to do, which was break the Oriel part of Akatosh by, the expungement of the taint, as discussed, is removal of the elven element of Akatosh forever. And so they made this staff called the Staff of Towers, which is connected to the 8 metaphysical towers that keep the universe stable, that's a whole other fucking thing, and we're not even going to talk about it. But it was built based on that, and using that power, they performed a dance upon the tower, most likely the White Gold Tower, to expunge Auriel from Akatosh, like once and for all. And when they did that, they caused the biggest dragon break ever. Trust me, Zeus, this is... I could literally go all night on this stuff. I'm keeping it as simple as I can just for Vigilant. They caused the Middle Dawn, because they had essentially replicated the Dawn era, a 1,008-year dragon break. Time went sideways for 1,000 years. That's why the Order being around for 2,000 years is kind of iffy, because there were 1,000 years where basically things went screwy. There are tons of different records. Listen, if I ever hit partner, I will do a 24-hour PowerPoint stream. You can hold me to that, because it's never going to happen, so I'm safe. Anyway, there's a ton of different contradictory... You can't see all the hand gestures I'm doing, but I'm doing them. Ton of different contradictory information during the Dragon Break. People were born and died. People came back to life. People died and were born. One thing talks about people giving birth to their own fathers because time was moving in such a wrong direction. And the only way people were able to guide themselves through it were by the motion of the stars and the moon. And I say moon because the 2 moons weren't as much of a thing during that time. There was instead a star called Nemole, the Blue Star, that only really seems to appear during Dragon Breaks. That's going to be relevant in Glenmoral. I'm going to hold off on talking about it for now. But basically, they could only really tell time by these 8 slowly falling stars, which were actually the 8 pieces of the staff, which broke. And this all happened because obviously they tried to split Akatosh apart. They literally tried to break Akatosh. They tried to break the dragon and caused all that, and it was really bad, and it was not a good thing. And a lot of the Alessians disappeared after that. Not all of them, like the Dwemer, but it was bad. It was a bad time. And a lot of them sort of recognized that they fucked that one up. However, it is never made explicitly clear whether or not they succeeded. That's up to interpretation. Anyway, it finally ended, and some of them defended it, some didn't. But this is something from a book called Where Were You When the Dragon Broke, which is one of the few accounts of that era, and even that's contradictory. No one understands what happened when the Selectives danced on that tower. It would be easy to dismiss the whole matter as nonsense were it not for the Amulet of Kings. Even the Elder Scrolls do not mention it. Let me correct myself. The Elder Scrolls cannot mention it. When the Moth priests attune the scrolls to the timeless time, their glyphs always disappear. The Amulet of Kings, however, with its oversoul of emperors, can speak of it at length. According to Hestra, Cyrodiil became an empire across the stars. According to Shor-El, Cyrodiil became an egg. Most say something in a language they can only speak sideways. The Council has collected texts and accounts from all of its provinces and they only offer stories that never coincide, save on one point. All the folk of Tamriel during Middle Dawn, in whatever when they were caught in, tracked the fall of the 8 stars, and that is how they counted their days. So yeah, that the only constant was the Amulet of Kings existing and then also partially disappearing, but Vigilant will get more into that. But yeah, it was a big thing. And then it got worse. Somehow it actually got worse, because the first recorded event after the Dragon Break. Oh yeah, the imagery, I could write so much on the imagery there, and the imagery comes up a lot in Glenmoral. The first recorded event was the Thracian Plague. It just gets worse. The seafaring race called the Slode invaded from the southwest, from the continent of Thrace, and brought with it the Thracian Plague, or Thracian Plague, and it wiped out, according to records, wiped out half the population of Tamriel. It was bad. It killed millions of people. Slowed moment, certified slowed moment. And it was so bad that for the only time in history, all of the different groups, like the elves, and even the elves and the Alessians, came together in a beautiful moment of harmony to make the All Sails Navy. And they all got together and sailed over to Thrace, and they sunk it. And they just... They were sick of it. They went there and used unknown magics to just sink it. And there are a few surviving Slode out there, but they got revenge pretty hardcore. And in doing so, it did, like, once that was done and once things were all chaotic, it led to finally the division of Cyrodiil. Thrace was a continent. How did that... I mean, Yokuda sank. They used powerful magic to just destroy it so much that what was left was just claimed by the ocean. That's how... And we don't know what kind of magic was used, because it was so powerful that they refused to write it down because they didn't want anybody to use it. But they basically nuked them. Anyway, with all that instability, Cyrodiil began to divide. And after the Alessians kind of limped along for another, few hundred years, or 1,000, depending on who you ask, but the Order was pretty much just Cyrodiil at that point, and it just kind of limped along for a while. At one point... Oh yeah, I should do a whole thing. We're moving to the next slide, and we are almost at the end of the Alessian Order bit. This is the last Alessian Order slide. So the end of Order. So Cyrodiil was kind of isolated. There was one point when Empress Hestia... Alright, Mango, have a good one. Empress Hestia kind of made a deal with the Bretons at one point to kind of reincorporate them back into it. If you remember Where Were You When the Dragon Broke, points out Hestra, who is probably the same person as Hestia. It's unclear. So then, after all of that, a group of folks in Cyrodiil, in Western Cyrodiil, broke away and declared themselves an independent group called the Colovian Estates. And this was the first time a piece of Cyrodiil had full-on split off. And that led to the War of Righteousness. It was a 10-year war. It was a brutal war. Like Iliac Bay, which was part of High Rock, during the war, a majority of the population there got wiped out. It was a brutal, brutal war. But it only lasted 10 years. Strangely enough, after all of this other shit, the War of Righteousness lasted 10 years. The Alessians lost the Amulet of Kings, and with it their divine mandate. And after those 10 years, the Empire fell apart. That was the end, and Cyrodiil was in chaos until Riemann came to power, but after all that, after thousands of years of rule and countless deaths and chaos, it ended in 10 years, and it's just such a fitting end. And the Marukati selectives were dissolved. The Alessian Order was pretty much forgotten. People stopped practicing their religion. In some parts of Tamriel, it's straight up banned. You can't even bring it up. But yeah, that was the end of it, and that means we made it through. Just a little piece of celebration, because we finally fucking made it through the Alessian Order slides. That was 12 slides, by the way. And we made it through. So thank you for sticking around. And we have a little bit left, but now we just have to talk about a few important things that are relevant to Vigilant. Just a couple things that aren't necessarily part of that history, but are important to know. First one is, unfortunately, Molag Bal. He sucks, and we hate him. He's the Prince of Domination and some other stuff that I'm not going to talk about. He created vampires. He attempted to pull all of Nirn into his realm in an event called the Plane Meld, which is what happens in Elder Scrolls Online. Boo. He has a realm called Cold Harbor, which you can see on the left there. It's basically dark blue. It's super cold. It's always dark. Lot of rivers of gross, blah, blah, blah. It's a bad place. You don't want to be there. It's like the worst place, maybe. He also has an artifact called the Mace of Molag Bal, which is what corrupted Altano, if you remember, if you care. He's the worst. He created vampires by, poor LeMay. And everybody hates him. Even the other Daedric princes hate him. On a lighter note, we get Meridia, Girl Boss season. She is the arch enemy of Molag Bal. So that's, we gotta love her for that right off the bat. She was also the patron of the Aelids and blessed Umaril, who, they did some slavery, so maybe she's not perfect, but she is, she is a girl boss, so. However, she's also one of the few considered to not be evil. And typically, that's why she's worshipped by people more openly, because she's, people like her. She's light and life and whatnot. However, she's actually one of the most dangerous. And her whole thing is that she ultimately wants to create a world without free will of perfect order, and can basically make people immortal at the cost of their free will and stuff. So, you take the good with the bad. There's also a lot of parallels between her and Lucifer, the fallen angel, but I'll save that for later, because that's purely speculative. Anyway, she's relevant. The other thing is that during the First Era, she pulled a city called the Hollow City that was being besieged by Molag Bal worshippers into Cold Harbor to sort of use as a foothold against them. Now, when they teleported, it kind of fucked up and a lot of people there died. But she kind of has that as a foothold, and if you've played Elder Scrolls Online, that's where you go at the end to use as a base of operations against Molag Bal. But yeah, that's her. And there's one more who is Jyggalag, who is the 17th Daedric Prince and was only known in Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion because way back in the day, the Daedric Princes... I'm just stretching. Oh, popcorn buns. The Daedric Princes cursed him to become the Daedric Prince of Madness, Sheogorath, because basically he was too strong. He would go on these giant, like, invasions called the Grey March and would just conquer huge chunks of Oblivion. And all of the princes, this was early on and the princes weren't as divided, they came together and cursed him to become Sheogorath. Now, that won't happen again because the princes, like, a lot of them hate each other now, but fell for the classic Sheogorath prank. But during the events of Oblivion, the champion of Cyrodiil, the protagonist, frees him and then becomes the new Sheogorath, which sucks for them, but, you know. And so then Jyggalag's like, all right, I'm going to go resume the Grey March. I will see you later. And we do not hear from him in Skyrim, but he is presumably growing in power and has probably already invaded other realms of Oblivion, but we didn't hear about it. And also Laza, that the person who keeps getting mentioned in the books. I'm not going to spoil them too much, but we know that Laza is connected to Jyggalag in some way. And I know the full way, but I'm not going to tell you. Last thing to know is the Knights of the Nine, and we are almost done. I swear to God, we have like 2 slides left. We are really going to do it. Anybody who has stuck around, the like handful of you that have stuck around for this whole thing are gods among men. We're going to talk about Jyggalag lore, I promise. I promise. So, Knights of the Nine. They were these dudes in the Third Era. I'm glad you're loving it. Thank you. I really love doing this stuff. So in the Third Era, this dude named Sir Amiel, who established himself as a hero during this thing called the War of the Isle, started to seek out the relics of the Crusader, namely being Pelennor, because he believed that they were, like, righteous objects and would unite people, blah, blah, blah. And he made this order, the Knights of the Nine, and they were basically the heroes of the day. They would go out and slay monsters, blah, 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 and each one was devoted to one of the divines, and one of them, Sir Beric, or Sir Berich, I think it's Sir Beric, was from, like, a super popular noble family, and he sort of brought them to prominence as one of the Knights of the Nine, and then they got huge. But then there was this thing called the War of the Red Diamond. If you've done the Wolf Queen or the Potema quests in Skyrim, it was that. This woman, Potema, the Wolf Queen, declared a war over, like, the rights to succession, because she did have legitimate claim to throne as a blood relative of the Septums, but they gave it to somebody else, and there was a big old war, and it was called the War of the Red Diamond. And when that happened, the Crusaders all got conscripted to join separate sides. And so there was, you know, it kind of fell apart after that. A lot of them died in battle, blah, 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 and they failed to recover all the relics, and when they came back, Sir Beric kind of betrayed them and dissolved the order, and the ones that survived continued to seek the relics or defend the relics, but they did eventually die, and it was not a happy ending for them. Very much not. So the 9 knights are, we do have to talk about them at least briefly, and then we will be done. We will be done. We will actually be done. Follow and subscribe, blah, blah, blah. So Sir Amiel founded the Knights, and he was generally like a good dude who was devoted to the cause, and he, stayed loyal to the beliefs of the Knights of the Nine, even during the whole war and stuff. And at the very end, he stayed to safeguard. Oh my god, I just noticed a typo. He stayed to safeguard the relics and died a hero at the very end. And he was devoted to Akatosh. Sir Beric was the bad one. He came from the really powerful family and made them popular. However, when the war broke out, he was in support of it. And he ended up being the one to betray the Order for political gain, by using his status as a crusader to rise in power rather than to help the people. And he's bad. We don't like him. There was another one, though. Look, don't rub it in, okay? I'm embarrassed enough. Another one, Sir Caius, who was one of the kinder ones, devoted to Stendarr. He tried to save the Order by trying to stop them from going to war, and when he tried to stop Beric, Beric basically forced him to draw his sword, and then Beric killed him right then and there. Beric killed him, and he couldn't be prosecuted because it technically counted as self-defense, and that's one of the things that led to the dissolution of the Nine, is he just straight up killed that guy. Poor Caius. Another one, meanwhile, Sir Ralvis sought the mace of the Crusader, but basically in the process of trying to seek it had to pass a trial, and he failed. And so he left the Order because, it just broke his spirit completely and ended up dying, that way. And he was laid to rest by the remaining Crusaders. So he, died broken is never a great thing to have on your lore entry. Yeah, no kidding. He was devoted to Zenithar, not Zenithat. That was a typo. I'm very embarrassed. Don't make fun of me. Then there was Sir Juncan, who sought the boots of the Crusader, but he did find them, but he died after discovering them. He didn't get to actually recover them. He and Sir Gregory were very good friends, you could say. He was devoted to Kinnereth. Meanwhile, Sir Gregory, we don't have as much on. All we know is that he was a good dude, and he was killed in the War of the Red Diamond. He got killed in the battle. He was devoted to Bella, so you know he was a feminist. You know. Sir Toralf is also one we don't know a lot about, but he also died in the war. He was devoted to Arkay, and that's pretty much all we know. Sir Henrik, meanwhile, he decided during the war he wasn't going to have any part of it, so he just left. He went off on his own to go find the shield of the Crusader, and he found it but couldn't retrieve it, and so he just instead stayed to guard the fort where it was, and ultimately died guarding it. But he is like a ghost in the Knights of the Nine, if I remember right, and he was devoted to Julianos. Now, Sir Casimir found the gauntlets of the Crusader. He jaded by his experiences in the war, he left the Order, and then became, it really messed with him, so he became kind of cruel. And then at one point, while standing on the steps of... He was devoted to Mara, but he also obviously worshipped all the other ones. While standing on the steps of a temple of Stendarr, a beggar, bumped into him and knocked him over, and he killed him. He just killed the innocent man right then and there and was cursed by Stendarr. The gauntlets fell from his hands and stuck where they stood, and nobody could retrieve them. And he was cursed to wander, and yeah, basically, what you need to know about the Knights of the Nine is that they were a bunch of idealists who suffered pretty terrible fates in the quest for righteousness. And basically, it's just kind of a bummer. Which is, I probably shouldn't have ended on this, but you do end up getting to vindicate them in the Knights of the Nine DLC for Oblivion, so that's good at least. But those are the non-Alessian Order things you need to know. There is more, but I chose to not include it because I am, just like Stendar, I am showing mercy. And with that, we did it. We actually made it. We got the whole way through. Here's a picture of my beautiful sons, Lothric and Lorien, as thank you for watching. For watching a very, very long PowerPoint. That was 30 slides, by the way. Nearly half of it was just the Alessian Order. So, thank you all for watching through that whole thing. I spent a lot of time on it, so I hope you like it, because it is very special to me.